really excited to have back with us in Portland Professor Chris McNally. We've seen him here a few times. He's a favorite for sure. He is an associate professor of political economy at Chaminade University in Honolulu and an adjunct senior fellow at the East-West Center as well. His research focuses on comparative capitalisms, especially the nature and logic of China's capitalist transition, and on the implications of China's capitalist reemergence on the global order. He has edited 4 volumes, including an examination of China's political economy, China's emergent political economy, Capitalism in the Dragon's Lair, as well as authoring numerous book chapters, policy analyses, editorials, and articles. Please welcome Professor Chris McNally.
Thanks, Tom, for a nice introduction. We have a beautiful day today. I'm really kind of honored to have this beautiful view behind me. So if you want to look at the trees instead of me, be my guest. It's probably a better view. It's kind of a slightly difficult transition to make, just from the Erhu, from very musical to basically contemporary China. We're really going to be talking about what is going on in China right now and a certain interpretation of it, seeing China basically as an emergent capitalist power. Now, can everybody see? This is a PowerPoint, so we have a relatively small screen and it's on this side, so I don't know if those in the audience who are sitting here on the left, if you can see that you can swoop over to the other side. There's still lots of room over there, so whatever works better for you. Let's see whether this works. Oh, it does. So after I basically did a lot of work on what I call China's capitalist transition, which basically is trying to understand what happened to China domestically, going from what basically was a state socialist system to what is now some form of emergent capitalism, I started to look at more what is really happening, not only in terms of China domestically, but what are China's likely global influences going to be. And the perspective I took is to basically understand China's domestic political economy as an emergent form of capitalism, Sino-Capitalism, I'll get to that in a moment, and look at it comparatively. First of all, how does this compare to other forms of capitalism that exist now in the global system? And second, how does it compare historically to when other major capitalist powers emerged on the global landscape and started to shape its international rules and norms? So I begin basically by looking at China's reemergence briefly, and then I'll transition over to looking at Sino-Capitalism, and finally, its global implications. As you perhaps are quite aware of, China, this is mainland China, basically did not exist in the top 10 in 1980. It was a rather insignificant economic player. Was actually quite important in terms of resource exports. China's global influence was in terms of oil exports and even exports of some foods, something that has quite turned to the opposite. By 2010, within about 30 years, China really jumped ahead from what was 11th position to 2nd position, and right now China is already 1.5 times the size of Japan. So China's economy is about 8.4 trillion, Japan's economy is about 5.5 trillion, and the US economy is nearing 16 trillion, about 15.7. So basically, if you look at China and the United States, China is still quite a ways away from the US. But since it's growing a lot faster, since its currency is appreciating, and since China has higher inflation domestically than the United States, it will probably catch up quite rapidly, somewhere between 2018 and 2025. The United States officially still adheres to a Goldman Sachs prediction that was done almost 10 years ago that China would overtake the US in 2027. The Pentagon sometimes still actually references that, but that is somewhat dated. The Chinese government itself has basically said we're looking at 2020, 2022. And that will have a profound impact in what is happening globally. Now, basically, my understanding, as I just mentioned to you, of China's reemergence, and I'm saying reemergence because China in 1800 was by far the biggest economy. Yes, it was not integrated into the global capitalist system at the time. It did not, in that sense, have global ramifications, but within Asia, China was absolutely dominant. Now, what is happening with China now is basically, in a sense, a reemergence. Some might even say a renaissance. But, and the Chinese government has been actually quite adamant about this, China is modernizing very much by imitating established Western models. Not only Western models, but also the models of Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. And so what is happening is something called Sino-Capitalism. This is a term that was coined with reference to Southeast Asia and sometimes also Taiwan. In Chinese, I call it 中华资本社会, 中华, because it does not just include China, mainland 中国, but also it includes Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, and all the overseas Chinese in places as far-fetched as Lima in Peru, or Los Angeles, or even nowadays here in Portland, where you're getting a sizable Chinese community. So this is a new capitalist system that has global reach already, but it looks very different from what we generally have imagined capitalism to look like, and especially from the way capitalism works in the Anglo-American, this kind of idea of a liberal, laissez-faire, small government, big capital. It looks very, very different from that. And I'll get basically to why it is such. Now, just because this is a talk where I want to tie in some academic ideas and some pointers perhaps for curricula and other things that pertain to your teaching, basically capitalism in China has been interpreted in many different ways. The reason is that it comes across as rather contradictory. If you look at China, you have the state is enormously important in terms of regulation. State firms are enormously important in terms of production. Indeed, some of the largest companies globally now are Chinese state companies. The biggest banks by assets in the global system are now Chinese banks. ICBC, Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, is now the biggest bank in terms of assets, not in terms of international trading. So it doesn't really have that much global influence, but it is big. You also have 5-year plans, the active management of markets by the government. Indeed, the Chinese government really distrusts markets, very different from what is happening in the United States. And the existence of what is a Leninist party, the Chinese Communist Party in and of itself. If you listen to people in Congress or you listen to Lou Dobbs, it still is Communist China or Red China. And that's very confusing, because if people then think, well, then why is China capitalist? What is really going on here? Indeed, there's been a proliferation of terms to describe China, many of which are in and of themselves absolutely contradictory. I love incomplete state socialism, which still kind of harks back to where China came from. Confucian Leninism is a very nice one, which I actually think makes real sense. You take Confucius, you take Lenin. Lenin, by the way, was an organizational genius. If he would live now, he'd be working for McKinsey and making big bucks, because he was really clever about organization. And then you get something like nomenclature capitalism. There's also other things like capitalism, socialism, or socialist market economy. Obviously, this is what the Chinese government itself uses and is also already somewhat contradictory. As a result, if you look at the literature, you have various interpretations. Huang Yasheng from MIT wrote the book Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics, but it's extremely critical of what is going on in China. Indeed, it basically blames China from having created a state-led system where the state is so dominant that it smothers private enterprise, and that it channels all of its savings to these big state conglomerates that are like dinosaurs and really don't contribute to economic growth. And as a result, in his opinion, China will probably face an economic crisis at some point. Min Jinping is even more outspoken. He really thinks China will have a crisis because of its state-led model. And you get Ian Bremmer from the Eurasia Group, who wrote a book basically on how the liberal system, the American-led global system, will be challenged by these new forms of state capitalism. And he clearly interprets China as only consisting of a state-led and state-owned economy. Now, others have taken a very different view. They've basically described China's economic reforms as being driven bottom up, that it comes basically from the grassroots, from entrepreneurs, especially at the beginning rural entrepreneurs, but increasingly urban entrepreneurs that have basically built some huge Chinese private companies. We should not forget that despite the protection that China puts on its internet, basically not allowing the likes of Facebook and Twitter and others into China, China has generated privately owned mega companies like Alibaba, like Sina.com, like Tencent. These are becoming real global competitors. They are basically perhaps somewhat behind Google, but they're really catching up, and they have some very innovative things, and they've got a huge market that gives them economies of scale. And these are private companies. They're listed in weird ways on NASDAQ. Basically, you can buy their shares, but you don't have property rights. Typical Chinese. So Opera Ni, recent book in 2011, Kelly Tsai, many others have argued that you have a form of, including myself, Gramsci capitalism that drives China bottom up. And then others, including some of my German colleagues, including Toby Tembrink, have argued that China is quintessentially liberal. So that China has adopted deeply liberal ways of managing its political economy that basically come from the Anglo-American, Anglo-Saxon liberal form of capitalism. Now, why do particularly Germans see it this way? Labor markets. Chinese labor markets are brutal. Absolutely brutal. Okay, you can be easily fired, you can be easily hired. When the financial crisis, the global financial crisis struck in late 2008, early 2009, export manufacturers in Guangdong let go 25 million people within 1 month. 25 million people within 1 month. That is labor market flexibility. If you come from a European perspective, even from an American perspective, this is really, in a sense, liberal. Okay, but nonetheless, again, China, it's a market liberal state capitalism. Again, the state reappears here. And finally, we've got outside-in networks. Yeo Tianxing in particular, but also David Zweig and more recently Ed Steinfeld have argued that China's economic growth is predicated on foreign investment, first from Hong Kong, then very importantly from Taiwan. That's what Yeo Tianxing talks about. She calls the book as Making Capitalism in China. Basically, Taiwanese entrepreneurs bringing their ways of doing things over to Xiamen and Fuzhou and Quanzhou, places just along the coast, opposite from Taiwan, and thereby transforming China, again, bottom up, but also outside in. So you have all these different interpretations. Ed Steinfeld actually has pushed this argument further and said that China has become the quintessential capitalist facilitator. It's allowed foreign capital to come in manifold ways and became the manufacturing platform for the globe. And clearly, anybody who owns an Apple, or for that matter, increasingly a Samsung. Though Samsung, they still make a lot of stuff in Korea, but Apple is basically made in China with parts that are sourced globally, and it's made by, interestingly, a Taiwanese corporation called Foxconn that has huge amounts of employees, one of the biggest in terms of employees corporation in the world, over 1 million right now. I know about it because my wife is from Chengdu, so I visit there a lot. Foxconn about 3 years ago has gone into Chengdu and started from scratch. It took them about a year just to get the factory going. They hired within 1.5 years 180,000 people. So from 0 to 180,000. All iPads in the world are now made in Chengdu. So this is kind of this model of this global facilitator, this enormously flexible, fast-moving, massive economies of scale type of ramping up of production that only China can do in this present time. So the answer to this question is, what interpretation is right? You read these books and you think, the world is either China is too liberal, or China is too statist, or it's all bottom-up driven, the state played no role, or it was basically a predatory, hindering role to China's development. All of these interpretations are both correct and false, because it's really a combination of all of these that has driven China's economic reforms and development. It is counterbalancing institutional complementarities, I'll get to that later, top down, bottom up, outside in, and now increasingly also inside out, meaning China is going abroad, really in some rather intense terms. So the argument is basically that China is undergoing a process of capitalist development with a combination of these various elements. And if you look at history, the closest actually parallels are Meiji Japan from 1868 up until basically 1890s, 1900s. Bismarck's Germany, we have a nice little picture of Bismarck down there, as well as South Korea and Taiwan. And some of the eeriest parallels are actually to Taiwan. Very similar in many ways to what happened in Taiwan in the 1960s and 1970s. Not in the 80s, but very much 50s, 60s, and 70s. So what is Sino-Capitalism? I kind of whetted your appetite, hopefully a bit, to kind of understand this term. What is really going on here? Well, China has used a very experimental way of reforming. and I will not get back to this later, but to kind of, if you especially talk to your students, and or if anybody ever asks you what can we learn from China, this is basically it. Is that lots of things cannot be replicated abroad, but this experimental way of managing the economy, especially of setting up experimental zones where you test out a policy, you see what works and not, and then the things that work, you basically scale up to the national level. That is actually a very clever way of doing reform. Now, the United States itself does so as well. We have a federal system. We have lots of experimentation going on the state level. Just north of here, there's some very interesting experimentation going on, state of Washington. But also the healthcare law, Obamacare, was basically tested in Massachusetts. And the problem in the United States is we haven't done very well in scaling up to the national level. We are really good at experimenting on local levels, but we're not good in scaling it up. I mean, we know why. I mean, we have real problems in our Congress. It's become dysfunctional. It's very difficult to pass overall laws, that affect the nation as a whole. Real reform has become almost impossible. But in China, this is still very much possible. You clearly have a rather dictatorial, authoritarian government that basically rides roughshod over the people, a lot less so than 10 years ago. But still, if the Chinese government wants to do something, and it's hell-bent on doing it, it'll get it done, believe me. So you have this intriguing interplay between development planning top-down, where you have an overall plan, but the plan is not like central planning in the Soviet Union. It's much more like, these are some ideas. These are a few things we would like to get done. Like, let's build an internationally competitive solar industry, solar panel manufacturing industry. Well, they did it within 4 years, basically. China now has 60% global market share in PV solar panels. You might say unfair, trading, subsidies, all kinds of other things. Yes, true, but they do get it done in a kind of top-down planned version. But on the other hand, you also have a lot of bottom-up experimentation. Mind you, all of these solar panel manufacturers are private. They're not state-owned. They get huge amounts of subsidies from local governments. They have industrial parks tailor-made to their needs. And they can ramp up to scale economies that is almost impossible anywhere else. Only the United States actually gets close. So you have this real interplay of top-down, overall visionary planning, bottom-up experimentation, entrepreneurship, flexibility that kind of makes this policy mix work, and ultimately that has allowed the Chinese to overcome some extremely complex challenges without following the Western textbook. This is something very important. Philosophically, the Chinese do not believe in liberal market capitalism. No way. Okay? So often what you find in China is they want to establish the same outcomes as you might get in a purely marketized system, while retaining enough state control to roll things back in case stuff gets out of control. So you have this constant interplay basically between state planning and yet liberalization. And the two go hand in hand. The state strengthens itself while you get a more liberalized market economy bottom up. And it's kind of contradictory for us to imagine, but indeed that's actually like a lot of clever liberalization works. I mean, imagine, I don't know if you still remember this, about 12 years ago, 13 years ago, California liberalized its energy market, its power market. Total chaos. Why? Because they did not reestablish the state sufficiently powerful enough to guide what was going on. And I'll get to this theme again and again and again. Now, if you want to look at Sino-Capitalism, it is layered historically, as all systems are, including the American system. And the various layers that I just want to point to quickly are first China's imperial political economy after, basically before 1911. I will get back to this. Clearly, socialist and central planning have had a deep influence. You have big state-owned enterprises. You continue to have these 5-year plans, although they're much more indicative rather than they're command-like. Asian development institutions, they've copied heavily from South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. In various ways, the Chinese really have imitated these development models very closely. And finally, some Western liberal influences. I already mentioned the labor market reforms and the modern Chinese experimental approaches that I just mentioned. I would actually call this, in some sense, the Dengist approach, because this little rather fiery Citronese Deng Xiaoping was really, he had such a good knack for these, I don't care whether it's a black cat or a white cat as long as it catches mice. So basically, throw ideology out, let's be pragmatists, whatever works, let's do this. Or crossing the river by groping the stones, very kind of experimental, So, yeah, he's playing bridge probably helps your brain develop. So ultimately, Sino-Capitalism, in my opinion, is conceived of being constituted of three institutionally interrelated elements that are not, and this is somewhat in the literature, I don't know how many of you are political economists or political scientists, these elements are not aligned with each other. It's not all liberal, free market types of elements. Rather, these elements are complementary. They are basically in a sort of duality or dialectic. They compensate for each other's weaknesses and strengths. First, global integration. Yes, neoliberal globalization began basically in the 1980s with Thatcher and Reagan. And China, when it started its reforms, did so exactly in this point of time. So since 1980, these forces of neoliberal globalization have prodded the Chinese to adopt a lot of this. And most importantly, in comparison to Taiwan or South Korea or Japan, these countries never really allowed foreign direct investment in. Even nowadays, Japan has one of the lowest stocks of foreign direct investment, accumulated foreign direct investment over 50, 60 years than any other country. Very, very low. Japan has very low penetration. Only a few American companies made it, including Coca-Cola, including McDonald's, but really not much else. Okay, if you go to Japan and you see an American car, it's probably a stretch limo, driven by some Yakuza boss or so, but really not much else. So you get, again, very high absorption capacities. I already talked about this. The literature by Ed Steinfeld very much expresses this. The electronics industry is the most interesting, where you have American flagship companies like Intel and Apple, where you have the contract manufacturers. Actually, you have the chip manufacturers, many of which are not Chinese. So that would be Infineon of Germany, or Samsung of South Korea, or the big Taiwanese chip manufacturers. And then that goes into China, it gets assembled in China. Although China is also doing things like the casings increasingly, a lot of the plastic, a lot of the batteries and all of these things. So there's more and more located in China, but you have globalized production that has its center of assembly in China. But China also has followed, despite its liberalizing tendencies, very much its Asian predecessors. And I mentioned this, they have various subsidized programs in investment. The solar panel industry is a beautiful case of that. I always laughed when Solyndra came up in the United States. You probably heard about the Solyndra case. I can tell you there are hundreds of Solyndras in China, and nobody cares. Nobody really cares. I mean, at some point the people are going to care, But maybe that is, the inherent benefit of having this Leninist authoritarian party that can quash basically any organized opposition, is you can do things as a government that fail. And you can start again. You can regroup yourself and do it again and try again and again and again to get it done right. Often in a democracy, you can't even start to try it because, wham, people already are saying, don't build this rail line. We have this in Honolulu. They're trying to build something like your Max, in Honolulu, and it's a catastrophe. Anyway, or the high-speed rail in California. Yeah, another very nice example. It's a good idea. I love high-speed rail. But, in China, they're doing it on a continental-sized scale in a quite incredible way. And the other thing that the Chinese clearly have used, they have subsidized, in a sense, their whole country's manufacturing by keeping the exchange rate undervalued. And even now, the yuan is probably about 10, 20% undervalued, although it's getting much closer to what is a healthy exchange rate. So it's moved from 8.28 to the dollar to 6.1, actually 6.09 a few days past. So it's appreciated like 35%, but still, the yuan could continue to appreciate. The second element, so we have this global integration, absorption of both global norms, rules, but especially global capital and enterprise, including some Asian developmental models. Bottom up, you have basically enormous entrepreneurship in China. enormous vitality. So this is really not a form of pure state capitalism, quite unlike what you would imagine state capitalism to be, because you have these thousands upon thousands of private enterprises that often group in clusters and over time have developed very fine divisions of labor. Each small, I mean, these are not small companies. They often have 1,000, 2,000 employees. So in the United States, they'd be big companies. But in China, they would be medium-sized. And they produce one particular ingredient to something like a lighter or a necktie or a shirt. There's companies that have specialized on making buttons. And now China makes basically all the buttons in the world. There are companies, as I mentioned, special on lighters, for example. Wenzhou, which is in southern Zhejiang, now makes about 85% of the globe's lighters. And you go to Walmart, and that's where this stuff comes from. It comes from these production networks. These are not state-owned companies. Walmart sources very few goods from state-owned companies. So, and this is really a very flexible system. It's driven by networks. And it integrates China also globally. And network capitalism is not only a Chinese, mainland Chinese, it's very much driven what has happened in Taiwan. And even if you go to Southeast Asia, if you go to Malaysia, I know that you're sitting a bit far away, but if you look at the top 20 tycoons, the richest entrepreneurs and business corporate leaders in Malaysia, most of them are of Chinese origin. And Robert Kwok, who sits there number one, so the top elderly person in his 80s. His group owns brands like Shangri-La Hotels. You ever been lucky enough to stay in a Shangri-La Hotel? Well, very good for you. So, and they also own the South China Morning Post, interestingly, which is the premier English newspaper in Hong Kong. He made his business with sugar trading, commodity trading, obviously being based in Malaysia. But the company has become a huge conglomerate. He's one of the richest men globally. And he's the quintessential, in a sense, network capitalist, Chinese entrepreneur that's built a massive, basically, sprawling corporate empire in the globe. And a lot of his investments now are in mainland China as well. So one of the interesting things that has happened is a lot of these overseas Chinese, including Hong Kong, also some Taiwan, but especially Southeast Asia, they have really deeply invested in mainland China and are part of that mainland Chinese economy while being internationalized. Finally, we do get to state-coordinated capitalism. Yes, China has a very important state-coordinated element. In many ways, the Chinese state has fostered and guided capitalist accumulation in China. It's really supported capital accumulation. If you look at China's high-speed rail program, the real purpose of it is actually to aid business, honestly. And if you ask, I have groups of Chinese entrepreneurs coming in once, twice, thrice a year, and I often do ask them this question, do you think high-speed rail is a good idea or a bad idea? And really 90% all raise their hands and say, it's a good idea. And I do laugh a bit at American commentators because like 3 years ago, you could hear the Wall Street Journal saying, yeah, they're building high-speed rail, but it's going to bankrupt them. Because I went to this train station in southern Guangzhou or in Hongqiao in Shanghai, and the train station was totally empty. Now, that was 3 years ago. The high-speed rail in China is absolutely at capacity already. It's full, absolutely full. That's become the real problem. Businessmen are now, and businesswomen, basically are complaining it's too full. Okay, they should run more trains. And they're really trying to run more trains, but if you go about 250 miles an hour, you have to have certain spaces between them. And we know why, because they had a very bad accident. So they slowed the trains actually down because of that and put in more distance and also have much better signaling equipment, which was one of the problems. And you can basically see this kind of state-led, perhaps quintessentially, yes, you have huge amounts of state-owned companies. They moved basically from being worth about 360 billion, what was that? In 2002, in a mere 8 years, they moved from 320 billion to being worth 2.9 trillion. Okay, these state companies, why do we even put a worth on them? Because the main assets of these state-owned companies actually are listed on a stock market. So what they do is basically the state-owned company becomes a holding corporation, and they take the best assets and put them into a unit that gets listed on the Shanghai or Hong Kong or New York stock market, and therefore we actually can put a very clear value. I mean, these are companies that are traded, so there's a clear value on how much they're actually worth. That's a lot of money. So some people always say China will grow old before it grows rich. Yeah, maybe. They have demographic problems. I'll get to that in a moment. But the government has so much money. So they have they can start to privatize these things and go for it for a long, long time. That's how Europe and France kept itself afloat in the 80s and 90s. Not much left now. Crown jewels have been sold off. Not in China. The Chinese government has kept its crown jewels. It's not that the people are very happy about that, by the way. Chinese people are actually quite upset, especially if you talk about telecoms carriers. They get upset that they charge you both ways. And so, state-owned companies, they're even worse than the worst capitalists. They're totally profit-oriented. So it's kind of an interesting play. So basically you have various elements that are state capitalist, yes indeed. The most important is actually top-down Leninist incentives. This is in many ways the glue that keeps the system going. If you're a cadre on the level of the county or township or higher up on the provincial level, the prefectural level, you get evaluated every year. Indeed, the Chinese have started to issue these kind of little manhua cartoons on Youku. I just got another one. I'm getting these. The Xi Jinping propaganda department has become quite inventive, I must say. I have to give them 5 points for that. So there is one, and if you're interested, I can send it around, that basically tells you this is American democracy, and basically the subtitle would be, if there are subtitles, it's actually in English. Interestingly, English with Chinese subtitles. But the American system is basically you need lots of money to become president. Okay, the British system, you really need to be a good orator and move yourself up in the party. But the Chinese system, you have to be trained for 30 years. We're a real meritocracy. You start on the bottom and you work yourself up, and only the very best get to the top. So it's one-sided interpretation. But the incentives do to some extent work, meaning that local cadres are incentivized to grow their economies, to build new industries, to establish infrastructure, and increasingly also things like schools and hospitals, etc. You have state control over the largest firms. I already mentioned this. Wide array of regulatory tools that can frustrate all kinds of businesses, American businesses, but also Chinese private businesses. And state control over the financial system. No Wall Street. This is capitalism, yes, but no Wall Street, no financial capitalism. All the biggest brokerages, insurance companies, and banks are state-owned. Okay. So, and they all have played a very crucial role in basically producing the firma, the company, China Inc., with good old Mao smoking a cigar. Isn't he a wonderful pop figure? Now, basically, there are historical parallels to that. For those of you who are historians, apologize my social scientific treatment of this, very crass. But you basically had in the imperial, especially late imperial times, meaning Qing dynasty, but also Ming, Yuan dynasty, a dominant state, subservient capital, and middle classes, really no separate sphere of the economy. There was never this Adam Smithian idea of the invisible hand, the laissez-faire, the state as a night watchman, and the market does its own thing, and the less of a government, the better off the market is. This never existed, obviously, in imperial times. You always had the state smack center middle in what was actually quite a marketized economy. I mean, China had some of the most vibrant land markets of anywhere 500 years ago. Okay, they already traded land, invested land in a very capitalist manner, so to say, 500 years ago. But the state was always kind of in the middle. And if you basically look at it, you had the state like kind of almost an umbrella, tributary umbrella lording over the political economy. Mind you, this was a very minimalist state. We now know that actually the imperial state made do with very few mandarins. In a sense, it was quite efficient because it mainly worked through the local gentry, and the local gentry were land-holding classes. They were quite rich, and in many areas, especially in the late imperial area, especially in the 1800s, they also became merchants. They became in jewelry, for example. They started to deal with jewelry, or they started to deal in commodities, salt being a prime one that was controlled by the government, but there was a lot of money to be made if you got a license. And over time, these small cap merchants did accumulate capital, but they didn't use the capital to build profit-oriented companies. Rather, they often invested it in A, land, and B, in their offspring. meaning they had as many sons as possible, and then they educated those sons to become mandarins. So very different from the American system, where if you're really, 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 really rich, like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, what do you do? What do you do? Exactly, yes. You build up a trust, you build up a charity, but it's in your name and it's with your vision of whatever it wants to do. And it's a very personal, in a sense, capitalist enterprise that you could argue, although it does good for society, it also puts enormous glory on that individual, whoever funded it. In China, those individuals never could claim that glory, because if you became so rich, the government would come after you. It would try to expropriate you because you're basically challenging its power. So rather than doing that, you invested in your offspring so that they became part of the imperial system itself. You, in a sense, melded into the state. So when Bill Gates once was asked, would you ever want to be president of the United States? He said, no, I'm not interested in it, and I think there are people who are more capable. Or I would say people who are more wacko than him and are interested in that job. You don't have to do that. If you're Bill Gates, if you're Warren Buffett, if you're Richard Branson, if you're somebody very rich, you don't have to. There's other avenues to your own self-glory. And for some people, it's obviously private jets and diamond collars on their little chihuahuas. But you have lots of opportunities for that. You didn't really have that conspicuous element in imperial China. And although there's lots of it now, there's Lamborghinis and Ferraris. We have all these beautiful accidents that happen in Beijing with these fast cars and illegitimate children of party. It's beautiful. I mean, it's really it's wonderful, wonderfully scandalous, actually, Chinese, the system. But you still have a system that if you become so rich that you could challenge the government, and you make it clear that you might be challenging it, well, you don't end up very well. So you can go abroad, or basically you become very friendly to the party, and most rich people have done so. Again, this is another way of looking at it. You have this magnificent state lording over the system, very narrow kind of base for private capital, but it does reach very far up. It has become quite powerful, a very powerful market. China has a very powerful market economy. In some areas, in some sectors, more competition than perhaps anywhere else globally. So this is, again, it's not the state-regulated system, and yet society, civil society, is still somewhat clearly suppressed. And although it's starting to kind of ascertain itself vis-a-vis the state, it still actually is quite weak. And we saw that recently with various people who've been putting up blogs on Weibo, getting into problems and put under house arrest, or basically being taken in and giving a lecture. Don't spread rumors, like that. Oops. Okay. So I'm going to quickly point out a few kind of more theoretical, conceptual implications that go into what is very much the literature on political economy, but also development writ large. I talk about the unique duality. You already probably saw this coming. I've been doing this a lot. Mutual conditioning and strengthening, and finally deliberate ambiguity. And I'll explain each of these. They all sound a bit abstract to begin. Now, as I mentioned, this is not a form of capitalism like liberal market capitalism. Liberal market capitalism is envisioned basically, you take the state, you shrink it to its judicial functions, which is very key, very important, protection of private property, to its regulatory functions, and to its broader political functions, which increasingly have included social welfare, which goes beyond a pure neoliberal interpretation of the state. But all of the incentives in this system are kind of aligned. It all drives in the direction of market efficiency, maximizing market efficiency, at least in the ideal type. In reality, that's certainly not the case. China's capitalism yet is very different. It really is this duality, or as my German friends would say, dialectic of this kind of top-down state-led, bottom-up entrepreneurial-led, and these two forces have both basically coordinated with each other, they've melded with each other, yet they also actually are in friction and in tension with each other. So you have this very kind of unique bottom-up, top-down system where you had successful institutional hybridization, allowing them, very dissimilar types of capital accumulation, to coexist and indeed meld within this political economy and to become codependent. So the state-dominant mode, as you can imagine, relies on oligopolistic competition. This is often very friendly competition. About 7 years ago, the Chinese government decided we've got a bit too much competition in the telecoms carriers. So the biggest telecoms carriers globally are Chinese. China Telecom has 800 million customers. Okay, so yeah, 2.5 times the United States. Wow, Verizon, bye-bye. Okay, it's huge, really, and that's why Apple is so intent of having, they don't carry the iPhone, by the way, so Apple, this is a big thing. Once they get a contract with China Mobile, you'll see Apple's stock price go up. And they basically said, okay, we want to roll out 3G, 4G networks. This needs a lot of capital investment. We want more coordination amongst the companies. We don't want them to have cutthroat competition. So they basically took the CEO of one of the smaller companies called China Unicom and transformed over to China Telecom. Basically saying, okay, don't compete too much because you might end up being the CEO of your competitor. And you might have kind of, rubbed some people the wrong way. So be friendly with each other. You can be transferred. There's state-owned companies. It's the Communist Party that does these transfers, that arranges where the careers go. So you have really kind of friendly oligopolistic competition. The benefits of this are that you can have huge, very rapid investments in new technologies that can be coordinated. Those are the benefits. Disbenefits is, customers often get screwed. All we do. The American system is extremely expensive, actually, if you look at what it costs for your cell phones, etc. Or cable is another beautiful one. Everybody hates the cable companies, but they do charge a lot. And you get considerable support from state agencies, yet you still have independent companies, and you have several in the same sector, which allows for some competition, some competitive pressure to be exerted. Private entrepreneurial capital accumulation, on the other hand, is quite anarchic. So as my friend Dr. Shi Yinghong at People's University in Beijing once beautifully said, if you want to understand China historically, you have to understand it as totalitarianism or dictatorship top-down and anarchy bottom-up. That's Chinese society. Okay? You always have the state that tries to assert itself really, in a heavy-handed, very dictatorial fashion, really wants to order the universe in its image. It's a harmonious society, very Confucian. But it's not Japan. It doesn't work. Bottom up, it's anarchy. Constantly the Chinese will find ways around the rules and cut the corners, and here a bit of money and there a bit of guanxi, and let's have a long drink and get rid of that rule. Let's get the cadre drunk. That's kind of the motto of the Chinese way of dealing with it. So the alcohol becomes a lubricant. And it depends on the savvy of individual entrepreneurs, export to market pressures. And again, as I mentioned, these two modes, they meet, and often at the local state level. And local states have been very supportive of private capital accumulation. They've put in place industrial parks tailor-made to the needs of whatever industry is located there. So I visited this place, Guzhen, which is south of Guangzhou, only about 50 kilometers south of Guangzhou, not very far, very close to Zhongshan. And they basically do lights, these things. Huge chandeliers. I've never seen anything like that in those rooms. Really, please give me a break. The chandelier would be as big as this. If you hang it from here, where this thing, it will come down to the floor and it would take up this whole thing. If you really want to show off, go to China. Look at what some people are doing. Yeah, they built White Houses, some private capital. They built which is a replica of the White House. And French chateaux as well from the Loire Valley. Yeah. There's some, as I say, I'll get to that. There's some crass income inequalities that basically are totally on par with what we have in this country. But the local governments have been very supportive. So in this case, for example, they set up a whole new industrial park for the higher value-added LED lighting. They set up a huge exhibition center. They basically tore down most of the city and built a huge boulevard of about 8 lanes across with massive street lighting along of it, with all kinds of it. You know, street lights that look like palm trees, that look like chandeliers. Crazy stuff. And it gets, green, blue, red at night. So it gets very. I love Chinese cities at night. During the day, they're ugly because it's all brown. It's the air. But once evening comes, it gets very, very colorful. So that's the unique duality. Now, how did this occur? Again, this goes somewhat against so the unique duality basically goes against our understanding of capitalism. We shouldn't have a system that's so heavily state-led, top-down, yet so entrepreneurially bottom-up. The state should smother the entrepreneurs. But that hasn't happened. And in many ways, the entrepreneurs actually have shaped the way the state acts. And so you get this idea of mutual empowerment of state and society. It's been mentioned by Kohli and Xu back in 1994. Peter Evans in 1997, and then Wang, I think this was in either Comparative Politics or another journal. This was a review article. It's kind of fallen by the wayside. It doesn't really jive well with the basic ideological orientation of most of the social sciences, which is very neoliberal. It basically argues that the only way you can enact development is by both strengthening the state and society. It's mutual strengthening. If you get a very strong state and it smolders society, basically a Gaddafi, for example. So once Gaddafi's gone, what do you get? Anarchy. There's nothing there. Saddam Hussein, same thing. Or you get an enormously powerful society with a very weak kind of dictator. Maybe even Zimbabwe would be a good example, where basically you just have anarchy and really the state is enfeebled. If you want to have development, then what you need to do is strengthen both state power and societal economic power at the same time. And it's this kind of process that does really work in favor of economic development. So it's basically not a unilateral retreat of the state in favor of entrepreneurial market forces, but neither does it represent a process of deliberalization and state sector dominance that is described in Huang's Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics. Basically, both the state and the private sector have gained. So in the 2000s, which Huang Yasheng kind of says, this is really the time that private enterprise has been smothered, you actually see whole new sectors, be it wind turbines, solar panels, but also construction materials and a whole host of other kind of more mundane things that emerge in the private sector. The private sector becomes actually more powerful. By now, the state sector is roughly about 35% of GDP, the private sector about 65 to 70%. And that comes basically from 0 private, 100 state. So you do have a process of more and more private entrepreneurial capital accumulation, yet the state actually remains very powerful. Although the private sector is mainly composed of small and medium-sized enterprises, it's really risen from non-existence. And conversely, the state sector, although dominant, basically went bankrupt in the mid-1990s. It was losing money hands over fist. And the Chinese government decided, let's get rid of all the small companies that are in competitive market sectors. They called it feng xiao, beautiful Guinea thing, let go of the small. And the big ones, let's grasp the big ones and let's make them into big kind of oligopolistic companies in things like steel, telecoms, finance, petrochemicals, and obviously oil and gas and all other types of resources, aluminium. So although the state sector actually shrank, it emerged really energized and strengthened. It is quite profitable right now. And you have this mutual conditioning and strengthening of both of these forces in the Chinese developmental process. And so really you need to basically reorganize your toolkit and not see that the state can unilaterally retreat. And by the way, this has been the case in the West as well. The quintessential neoliberal experiment was the United Kingdom under Thatcher. And they started out with basically doing a whole host of liberalizations, including in the mining sector, steel, as well as automobiles. But in the mid-1980s, they started to liberalize telecoms. That was really quite avant-garde at the time. And the British basically found out that as they liberalized telecoms, the market became chaotic. So they had to reestablish a new governing regulatory body that actually was more powerful than what existed before when they just had British Telecom that was state-owned. So it's really a retooling and reorganizing of the state with liberal market forces rather than the unilateral retreat. So each time in the United States when you hear debates, oh, the government's too big and the government does this, I always laugh. This is stupid. This is really a stupid debate, okay? Get your government to do things cleverly, okay? Yes, shrink it in some areas. We got a regulatory state that really blows everything else away. I mean, look at our tax system. What chaos. And yet, then we talk about, oh, we need to retreat the state. No, reform it, retool it, restructure it. That's what counts. Make it business friendly, but keep regulatory power intact. And we get to the final kind of theoretical conceptual implication, which is called deliberate ambiguity and is basically related to China's political system. In many ways, you might argue that China is a maturing form of capitalism because private property rights, indeed the rule of law, is not very well established. And every Chinese will tell you this. I've interviewed many, many lawyers. And again, I asked them, so, what do you do as a lawyer? And they say, yeah, you need to understand in China, 没有法治, no law. There is no rule of law in China, okay? So I said, but you're a lawyer. I say, yeah, I don't do law. I do guanxi, I go out and wine and dine and get to, and introduce my clients to the people in the government who are going to make the rules on behalf of them. And I have my interns, the freshly graduated lawyers, they look through the laws because there are laws on the book and you need to go according to the laws. But there is this other layer. The government basically has a lot of leeway in interpreting rules. And that basically gives you a system where you have insufficient legal institutional certainty. Clearly you see this kind of Leninist with imperial historical antecedents. And institutional uncertainty faces especially Chinese domestic entrepreneurs. Indeed, I just talked to a group of entrepreneurs about a week ago, and I mentioned this to them, and I said, so, I suspect all of you, before you became rich, you must have done something illegal. So in your career, you must have done something illegal. And they all smiled. I mean, everyone was going like this. Yeah. And some of them went like this. Some of them were slightly embarrassed, pushed back. But no, I mean, even in the United States, I talked to a lot of private business people. They've done some illegal things. Cutting a few corners is probably normal. But in China, it's quite crass. It's really difficult to make money without, pulling a few strings, cutting a few corners. And so basically the party state in many ways, that's why I call it deliberate ambiguity, keeps the rules somewhat fluid, keeps legal interpretation up to basically party bodies rather than judges. So there's the career judges in China, yes, there are many, and they've become a lot better educated, but if there is a case that is sensitive, and this includes lots of commercial cases too, but certainly many criminal cases, and any case that involves a dissident or something political, they are not decided by the judges, they are decided by the political committees that are basically made up often of what would be a vice party secretary, maybe even the party secretary, depending on the locality and the case. So basically, the party state has kept these rules and regulations deliberately ambiguous as a means to keep discretionary power in the hands of local cadres. I call this guanxi capitalism in my own article. Most private enterprises therefore continue to employ guanxi networks to compensate for this institutional uncertainty and the lack of predictability, and also to create profit-making opportunities. And I've asked many Chinese entrepreneurs, what bugs you the most about the system? And again, this is typical, the schizophrenia of the business person, very similar to American entrepreneurs and business people who would be saying, Americans would be saying we want less regulation, but they would also tell you we want more clarity. So we actually want regulation, we just want to know what's going to happen into the future. China is very similar in a sense, is that basically we face too much ambiguity, we fear for our property rights, we fear for our business, we never feel totally certain in the wealth we've accumulated, and as a result we shift some of the wealth abroad, we put it into Hong Kong, we put it into the United States, we invest in a beautiful mansion and just south of Pasadena there's this San Marino. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this, but there's about 60% Asian right now, most of them are Chinese. And I lived there actually 12 years ago. Already then we saw the Mercedes 500 SELs, and that was basically, this is a Baofu Gambu, this is a Baofu meaning, a nouveau riche cadre that has, basically fled to the United States for some reason. We don't have an extradition treaty with China. It helps. So deliberate ambiguity acts in a sense as a lubricant for private capital and the party state to kind of coexist and become codependent. It's really a problem of the rule of law, and I'm putting this out as a question because the term constitutionalism is actually quite sensitive in China. The left of the party actually criticizes constitutionalism as a way to circumscribe the powers of the party and act kind of like a Trojan horse, open up an avenue for Western influences to take over and subvert party influence. So they see constitutionalism and rule of law as actually something dangerous and subversive to one-party rule. But on the other hand, we might argue whether these are necessary conditions for mature capitalism, whether we actually do need the rule of law. And if you look at most mature forms of capitalism, they have a form of constitutionalism and rule of law. They have the certainty of contracts and private property rights. And China is still kind of a work in progress. I love the example of Singapore, perhaps even more dictatorial than China in many ways, yet it has really the sanctity of contracts and private property rights. So you can have that even if you're a relatively dictatorially inclined system or one-party inclined system, as Singapore is. And you also have the problem of leadership succession. I mean, as China becomes much more powerful and as it wants to internationalize its currency, people who invest, more and more people will invest in China, and more people's livelihood and their economic interest will be dependent on China. Yet you have a system that in terms of its leadership succession is very much a black box. With power struggles that are really reminiscent of the Mao era. What happened, everybody thought, I think maybe Professor Zhang talked about this, everybody thought when the new leadership would come in under Xi Jinping that it would be really smooth sailing. The Chinese have perfected the leadership succession. It'll be harmoniously transiting from one cohort, it's the 4th generation to the 5th generation, correct. Unfortunately, it didn't quite unfold that way. Bo Xilai turned up and you got this beautiful scandal with his wife murdering a British businessman with probably whom she had an affair. Turns out she had an affair with the police chief as well, who first covered up for her, but then got cold feet because the party senate was leaning on him, and then fled to the American consulate general in Chengdu to spill all the beans. Rather nice. I think Hollywood's already making a movie out of it. But you have power struggles, and they're ongoing. You have enormous amounts of corruption cases that are being handled in the last several months, and all of them smell a bit funny. Yes, there is corruption, but they also tend to actually nab the people who belong into Bo Xilai's, Zhou Yongkang's, which was the law and order chief's kind of faction. So factional strife is well and alive in China, and it's a black box. We really don't know what's going on. And that lack of transparency on a global level is a problem. It's not just a problem for the Chinese. It's going to become a problem for all of us at some point. Now, fortunately, we have such dysfunctional Washington, D.C. that black box doesn't look so bad. We don't know what's going on, but at least they get their act together. In DC, we know exactly what's going on, yet, Anyway, you can't have everything. So I'm going to transition now to Sino-Capitalism in the global system. You have a nice little caricature of the Chinese party cadre and his businessmen stomping on labor. And indeed, that's what happened to some extent. You have enormous income inequalities in China. But you also have the emergence of basically China as a global economic and especially financial power. And that will probably be the issue that will influence us the most in our lifetimes. It'll be probably about a decade from now, but to make it very short, if we, the United States, if we lose our exorbitant privilege, meaning the dollar is the world's reserve currency and you can use dollars anywhere, you can put a few $100s in and you can go anywhere in the world, and anywhere they will accept it, basically, okay? Once we lose that, we'll probably face much more lethargic growth than we have now, and especially higher interest rates. On average, probably about 100 to 150 basis points, meaning 1 to 1.5% higher. So your mortgage, which is now 4.5%, would probably be around 6% on a 30-year fixed. So this is really enormously significant for us. But just to put it in a broader historical context, the global system, as it internationalized at first, was driven by mercantilism. So those are the Dutch and the British, who go basically into India, take over. The British found a beautiful cottage industry, grow a little plant called opium and, export it to China and then import from China the porcelain and the tea and the silk that the British were so addicted to. But even before that, it was about spice trade. Over the 19th century, just around 1850, the thought of Adam Smith and especially David Ricardo began to influence policy. In other words, the City of London, the financial industry, and the industrialists, Manchester and capitalism, basically became powerful enough to change the laws in Parliament. They repealed finally the corn laws, which basically mean dropping tariffs on the import of corn. This was beautiful for capitalists because you import corn a lot cheaper from France. That means the workers need less money to buy food. That means you can push down their wages. Marx basically was deeply influenced by exactly what was going on at that time. Now, since 1850, therefore, you had free trade shaping the global system. First the British, then the United States, somewhat reluctantly after 1945 until about 1980, and then under Reagan, full blast. Free trade, free financial flows, deregulation, privatization, laissez-faire global capitalism. The fewer rules, the better off we are. It is the first time since 1850 that you have a massive continental-sized capitalist power emerging that does not believe in this. And in my opinion, never, ever will. Okay. The Chinese love markets. They love dealing in markets. They love gambling, okay, very much. Almost born gamblers, look at Macau, from nothingness in 2000, it's now already, I think, double the size of Vegas. So you have clearly a people that love markets, but they also distrust markets. There's this almost healthy distrust, because once you liberalize markets in China, what happens? Somebody gets the brilliant idea, let's corner the market. They did this 3 years ago. Some person got the brilliant idea, I'm going to corner the market for garlic. They bought out huge amounts of garlic and put it in warehouses. And they drove up the price of garlic through the roof. We noticed it here. Garlic went up. It became very expensive in our supermarkets. Most of our garlic comes from China. And the Chinese government said, no. So they regulated and they basically forced, this is not what we want. So the problem in China is you liberalize a market, it becomes a casino. And the Chinese people and the government are deeply aware of this kind of fault in a purely laissez-faire, no regulation type of market system. So we will see something very different within about 10 to 15 years as China becomes more powerful. So Sino-Capitalism really is emerging as a complex global capitalist force incorporating kind of statist, flexible, network-driven, and liberal rules-based inclinations. And its sheer size means that it will have deep and profound influences. But on the other hand, China is also deeply influenced by the global system. So this is a very codependent, interrelated, interwoven type of relationship that is emerging. And just to kind of quickly show you this, quickly take this out of here. Kind of like American Idol. As an academic, you always feel slightly strange doing this. I don't know why. We basically ran numbers on Chinese exports and imports, and we added up the imports, exports together, so total trade. And we looked basically at about several examples. The first was industrializing Asia. So we just took those countries in Asia, besides China and Japan, and besides Taiwan, because Taiwanese figures are very difficult to get at. And we took Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines, Vietnam, and South Korea, which is up in the northeast, and looked at how much do they trade with 4 different trading poles. The first one being the EU, which is still the biggest trader in the global system. Japan, North America, US and Canada. We were very friendly. We put Canada in there. And China. And if you look at this, basically in 1992, when really China starts to emerge as an international trading power, you get flat triangles. And I'll show you this pattern in another example as well. China was like 2.9%, already some trade, but not very significant. And over basically 18 years, everybody else's share shrunk. Almost in half for Japan, in half for North America, and then about a third down for the EU, and China basically went from 2.9% to 16.5%, becoming by far the most important trading partner for industrializing Asia. So basically, China has revolutionized the East Asian trading system. Okay? While you had all of these countries trading with the markets of Japan, the US, and Europe, mostly in 1992, basically producing things in Malaysia and exporting them to the end market. Now what happens is that Malaysia might be producing some mid-level technology goods in Penang and then exporting them to China. They get assembled in China, and then China basically exports to these big markets, and increasingly also emerging markets. And this is my second example. So we kind of thought, okay, this is Asia. This is quite natural because all of these countries either neighbor China or are very close to China. We would kind of expect this pattern to obtain. But if you go as far away from China as you can globally, where do you end up? As far away from China. Yeah, Xudong knows the answer already. What is far away from China? Yeah, South America, exactly. The correct answer is Argentina. Now, Argentina has problems. So we looked at a country that is very significant in South America. We basically looked at Brazil. And lo and behold, we find roughly the same pattern. Yes, the European Union, which kind of makes this slightly ugly, unfortunately, is still by far the most important overall trading partner. Japan never was really that important, but China has gone from a mere 0.9%, a mere 1%, not even 1%, right up to 14.7%, and is now the single largest trading partner of Brazil. And that's a long way away. Okay. That's why the Chinese are so interested in the Panama Canal. Okay? That's why they're actually interested in building another canal through Nicaragua. There's all this talk going on. But the Chinese are deeply interested in both Africa and Latin America because that's where their future resources are likely to come from. And the Brazilians export to China what? What do they export?
Oil, lumber.
Some oil, that's coming. Petrobras, that's just starting. Some lumber, yes, and? The biggest of it?
Meat.
Very interesting. Meat. It's before you get meat, what do you feed those? Grains, exactly. Soybeans. Huge amounts. Basically grain feed. By the way, the biggest acquisition that a Chinese company ever made in the United States just occurred, totally under the radar screen. What did they buy? In the United States, bought a very large company.
Pigs.
Yes, pigs. Thanks. Pork. Yeah, pigs. So this is, as I was in New Zealand and somebody said, we're getting to the decade of protein. The biggest export to China is going to be protein. Okay, meats, grains, food, basically. New Zealand exports to China have gone through the roof, just through the roof. What? Milk powder. Because the Chinese distrust their own milk powder, everybody wants to buy New Zealand milk powder. So this is really quite impressive on a global scale. This is really transformative. Just to kind of speed forward, this is the final one. We basically took the figures of, actually quite fast today, I must know. Did help, huh? Did help. Getting few of just 5 slides, but speeds you up. Basically, we took contribution to global economic growth. So the global economy is about 60 trillion. It grows about 3% a year, so roughly by about 2 trillion. So those 2 trillion that the global economy grows every year by, we basically said how much does the United States and China contribute to it? We didn't do the EU because it gets rather ugly, basically. The EU has sometimes positive and sometimes negative. And when you had negative global growth in 2001 after the dot-com and in 2009 after the Lehman Brothers collapse and the financial crisis, yes, in those kind of situations we couldn't run it because you have negative global growth. But you can see that in 2000 the United States contributed a whooping, really 60% to global growth. This was the last time the US grew by 4%, by the way, interestingly. 2000, last time ever, the United States exceeded 4% GDP growth. And then basically throughout this kind of Bush era, you see the United States contribution to global growth gradually going down and China gradually catching up. By 2007, China overtakes the US. By 2008, China already contributes about triple to global economic growth. I can put this back. So basically, we end up with a reversed situation. Although China is a smaller economy than the US, about half as large, it grows so much faster that it has actually a more dynamic influence on the global picture. Now, this is just purely growth. The IMF actually ran figures looking at which economy has really more pull. And the US still has more pull because we really consume a lot. And that kind of consumption, if we have good economics, it means the American consumer gets healthier, people go to the malls, people shop a lot more, and that has big pull on the rest of the globe. The Chinese are not there yet. Their pull is more in commodities. If they grow fast, then there's more soybeans coming in, there's more pork coming in, there's more oil coming in. China, by the way, will be the biggest importer of oil this year. It's already overtaken the United States. We're really going like this. The United States imports are going down and China is going up. And that's making the Chinese very queasy about the Middle East. So, because they see an era where not only are they most dependent on the Middle East, but the United States might be quite inclined to retreat. So far, the Chinese kind of been free riding on a form of US protection, although the Chinese don't like it. They criticize the United States for being schizophrenic and supporting revolutions, and then you get chaos, and then you have to mop up the mess, and that's not good. The Chinese would just rather keep the dictators in place and let them do whatever they want. In that sense, they're really pragmatists. A friend of mine once said, this was actually Drew Gladney, one of his more enlightened comments, said, where is there a country in the world that is friendly with both India and Pakistan, Palestine and Israel, and at the time Iraq and Iran? It's China. They're really friendly with everybody. They're very friendly with Israel. Got actually the Israelis into real problems with the United States because Israel was starting to export some very high technology goods to China that had defense applications. Indeed, they even wanted to export an AWAC, an early warning radar system, to the Chinese. And the United States said, if you do that, we cut you off. So it's kind of an interesting relationship that China and the Middle East is not important, but it's still fascinating. Okay, now to get back to kind of our main theme, Sino-Capitalism, we will see a new form of Sino-Capitalism emerging, one that will influence you a lot more directly because China will start to go abroad. Indeed, China has about a stock of about 400 it's the second one there, 400 billion abroad. Most estimates, these are business newspapers, Forbes, etc. estimates, basically will go to 1 trillion. That's $600 billion in something like 7 years. That's a lot of money. It's almost 100 billion a year that will go abroad. And the Chinese already are heavily investing in the US, as we just mentioned Smithfield, which is the pork producer, but also taking stakes in energy. The Chinese are extremely interested in fracking and shale gas because they could have the biggest reserves globally. They're very interested in all kinds of acquisitions of technology and all kinds of resources and marketing avenues, such as Lenovo taking over IBM's computer. And perhaps most interestingly, outbound tourists. That is, the Chinese are this year, we have various kind of milestones. When I'm talking, you probably are picking up on that. It's getting a bit boring, the Chinese are the biggest oil importer this year. Yes, the Chinese also now are the biggest outbound tourist provider in terms of spending globally. So they're huge. They're basically keeping the Champs-Élysées moving. Really, I mean, you see people standing in line outside of the Louis Vuitton store, and they're all Chinese. And Louis Vuitton has been hiring all Chinese. So if you're a Chinese student studying in France, you picked up enough French, doesn't have to really be that good, you can find a job because all you need to do is speak Chinese. You probably won't see that much here in the Northwest beginning, but it will come because the Northwest is extremely beautiful. But already in Los Angeles and in New York, we have Chinese tourists. Some of them, mind you, in New York, we have all these weekend tourists who come in and buy an apartment in Manhattan for $30 million. in a snap weekend. So again, the very rich Chinese are scary in a sense because they've become the biggest luxury spenders, they're becoming huge real estate spenders, and yes, they're really spenders, I mean, scary spenders. But the mass tourist is coming as well. And Chinese investment will increasingly create jobs, will provide economic opportunities. If you go to places like Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, those governments are really, those state governments and local governments, they're really out for the Chinese investment dollar, extremely aggressive, I must say, especially in comparison. I mean, I don't know the whole country. Oregon has always been quite aggressive vis-a-vis Asia compared to Hawaii. You know, Hawaii basically, they always say they're aggressive, but they never do anything. So. That happens if you just, you know, you can rest on your laurels of beautiful nature and the federal government. In my opinion, this combination of top-down state-centric governance juxtaposed with bottom-up flexible network capitalism will remain. So even let's say China goes through a democratic revolution or a gradual democratization process, yes, the way the system works will change. There will be reforms. Even now, the Chinese are talking about very profound reforms to their urban system, especially the hukou residency system, and the financial system. So they're really thinking of bringing private capital into finance as well. But nonetheless, I suspect that for as long as I will be alive, there will be probably this kind of top-down, bottom-up, dialectic duality system that will drive Chinese capitalism. And so future policies are likely to keep this balance, and you can see that. The Chinese are proposing very, very far-reaching reforms. But those reforms do not intend the state to privatize its largest companies. There's no talk about this, nothing. They'll reform the companies. They'll collect more dividends from the companies into the treasury so they can invest in social welfare. But a lot of the reforms they're undertaking are actually quite the opposite of the US, where the reforms are about centralization and standardization, especially the medical care system. They're actually toying with ideas about fiscal reforms, basically meaning that rather than the provincial and local governments having to come up for local medical care and pensions, that they'll centralize this to the center, and that then hospitals basically will be owned like probably holding companies, but they really will be functioning like public companies, like public hospitals, not like private hospitals. So it's really kind of a retooling of the state, but this type of unique duality is likely to remain, and I already mentioned some of these various reforms, and we can come back to that during the Q&A. Now, what we're probably going to see is the rather rapid unfolding of a power transition. Unfortunately, with what happened in DC, with the dysfunctionality of Congress, Obama did not go to Bali and to Brunei and to Malaysia and to the Philippines. And this is perhaps really not so important in actual diplomacy, although it has effects on the free trade agreement we're trying to sign, the TPP. But symbolically, it has been actually very important. And basically, it tells a lot of in Asia that although Obama has been talking very loudly about a pivot to Asia, the dysfunctionality in DC and the dysfunctionality in the Middle East will keep any American president sufficiently occupied that they cannot really be that influential in Asia as they'd wish to be. Plus, with America entering in the 2020s, rapidly changing fiscal situation, we're actually doing quite well fiscally, but by the 2020s it's going to look bad because we'll have rapid retirement of baby boomers, and that's when the fiscal crunch comes. So Republicans actually have some correctness there. There's something that they're really right about. And so all of this put together basically means that at least within Asia and probably globally, we'll see quite a rapid power transition, especially in geoeconomics. And this is just a nice little quote from the Financial Times about 3 years ago, but very relevant for today. It is a discomfiting historical fact that great power shifts in the global economy are dangerous. They're really inherently dangerous because they really tend to coincide with extreme financial dislocation, currency turbulence, and trade frictions. And we're seeing some of this. You might even say that the financial crisis was the beginning of it, and I think historians will go back and see it as the beginning, but it'll be with us for probably about another 20 years because this transition will take time to unfold, and the United States is not going to go away peacefully. I had once a very high-ranking He was in a think tank at the time, and then he became a very high-ranking official in the State Department. As was Chatham House rules, so I cannot name the name, but he had a rather interesting quote which said, "We, the United States, will never leave the Western Pacific peacefully." And the Western Pacific is basically China's shoreline, Japan, Taiwan. So one of the most important things is not so much how the Chinese behave, but how the United States will behave vis-a-vis China's encroaching and increasing power. So, and in finance, it could also have huge dislocating influences if, as I already mentioned, the dollar uses its reserve currency status, which probably is a few years off. So as we undergo this rapid transition, we can see that Sino-Capitalism espouses very different values, international viewpoints, and as I haven't mentioned yet, there's less emphasis on legal norms and standards, more emphasis on interpersonal relations. Chinese have been so for thousands of years. Laws, China's very schizophrenic about laws. They have a kind of a legal tradition where the law is just ruthlessly applied or then basically not applied, and it's all about interpersonal relationships. Again, one of those kind of contradictions in Chinese history and the Chinese way of organizing a political economy. But even more importantly, there's a lot less trust of markets. There's a lot more trust in the state, in norms of hierarchy, of standardization, of centralized state governance that can create, indeed, a harmonious society, as the former president of China, Hu Jintao, said. So this is a very different philosophical interpretation. Giovanni Arrighi had this beautiful book, Adam Smith in Beijing, which is partially true, but it should have actually be called Adam Smith Will Never Fully Be in Beijing. Okay? They like parts of him, but they don't like the whole package deal. And this will have profound global influences. Maybe not necessarily negative. But all of it implies that we will be faced with a massive political economy that is a developing nation that is actually still a relatively early stage of its development with a very different form of capitalism, Sino-Capitalism, and that will shape our global system very, very deeply. Now, China has lots of challenges. I'll just list a few because we can get back to these in the Q&A. Sustainable domestic-driven growth is perhaps the biggest challenge, basically what the Chinese call rebalancing the Chinese political economy, moving from an export and investment-driven system to a domestic consumption-driven system. There's various very interesting debates on that. A lot of it actually goes into Chinese GDP figures, which are not very reliable. And it actually probably is the case that Chinese GDP is, first of all, underestimated by about 10-20%. So that's quite the opposite of what some people actually say in the press, where often they say, oh, Chinese GDP is overestimated. Probably actually the opposite. It's underestimated because there's so much black market income. You can't imagine how much black market income there is. All of you are probably professors here at a school. If you were in China, you'd be earning the equivalent of around $1,000 a month, and be asked to supplement the other $3,000 or $4,000 that you need to live with outside income. As an audience from the Midwest, this I think was the Wabash College audience, Peter knows them, once said, this is a Republican nirvana. Yeah, they really, after I explained what goes on in China, Republican nirvana, okay? Medical doctors in China are some of the most underpaid globally. Yes, very, very low. Their average income is probably about something like $30,000 a year, which is actually, even in China, quite low. If you're in finance, if you're in business, you can easily make $100,000 a year now. How do they supplement their income? Red pockets. Because if you go to a doctor, especially a surgeon or an anesthetician, you better go to their home a few days before the surgery and give them a nice red pocket. Indeed, there's actually on the web in China, you can look up the standard fees. Yeah, standard fee is about 5,000 renminbi, which is almost $1,000. So each surgery $1,000, that adds up. It's real money. My brother-in-law is a piano professor. He makes about 4,000 renminbi a month from his official job as a professor, and probably, and don't tell this to anybody because he doesn't pay taxes on that, another 30,000 renminbi by private students. 4,000 was it 30,000? So again, that's the Republican nirvana. You'll remember that. But so probably Chinese GDP is higher and consumption is higher, but still it's a very loop-sided economy, and you need to basically bring up wages. They've been going up by about 15% a year over the past 3 years. This is for manufacturing wages, blue-collar wages, so quite impressive. Wages have been also going up for primary school teachers. Primary school teachers in China make more money than university teachers. Kind of an interesting thing. Their pensions are better too. But you still have huge income inequalities. I mean, the Gini coefficient for China is about where the US is. And the United States is scary. My students just have showed me this YouTube thing where they kind of show you, where they have kind of this thing, and then the last 1% you cannot show because it goes stratospherically high. So they just do this, this is 1%, and then this is 9%, and then this is the rest. That's the United States. So it's really stark. China, same thing. It's really, really, really scary in a sense. And the Communist Party is trying to do whatever it can to at least give a semblance of socialism. Because socialist rhetoric is well and alive. So it's kind of, again, this very ironic, almost schizophrenic system where you have raw capitalism with massive, massive wealth being accumulated, and yet a Communist Party that really adheres to a socialist rhetoric. So you do get efforts to address this imbalance. Effective social services comes into that, demographic challenges. China will not grow old before it becomes rich. It will be rich enough to take care of its old people, but it is a massive challenge. Indeed, in the next 15 years, China is actually in a sweet spot because it will have less labor force entrants, meaning that if things go right and they can increase productivity, meaning technology, they will end up with the same thing that happened in Europe with the formation of unions, where unions basically drove up wage costs, forcing companies like Volkswagen and Porsche and others, Bosch, really to go up the value-added ladder. And China will face the same thing. So it's a challenge. You need to increase labor productivity, but you do not have the problem of finding jobs for millions of new labor force entrants. That's over. That's been the headache of the Communist Party. I mean, the last 20 years, communist leaders would say, I wake up in the evening, fearing that we won't have fast enough growth, we'll get huge youth unemployment and another June 4th. So that's kind of gone, because really the labor force is shifting very rapidly. And environmental challenges, I'll get back to this in a moment. Deliberate ambiguity, I already kind of talked about this, which I think is longer term, meaning 5 to 10 years. Perhaps the biggest challenge is really political reform, and not necessarily multi-party democracy, but getting a real efficient rule of law working where people have trust. And people don't really trust the rule of law in China right now. And finally, geopolitics and geo-economics. Indeed, geopolitics, geo-economics, I would argue, is the biggest challenge. And the Chinese government probably would agree with this statement, is that the biggest challenge that China faces is to rise, but peacefully, meaning without triggering a war or containment policies on the part of the United States and its allies. So this is really kind of the big trick. And it gets difficult because China has huge resource needs. It needs market access. It has massive economic heft and a global role, such as the internationalization of the UN. And ultimately, how can we all manage China's rise will be one of the most important questions in the next 5 to 10 years. Now, I'm just ending here. I always show this map because it's to scale, meaning the countries are as big. I need to get this out again. They are as big as actually they really are. So you don't get Greenland as big as Africa, which we get on a world map. And you see Russia is huge. Russia really is this kind of huge northern. I had this Russian graduate student from Moscow that was very much kind of in the classic yellow peril. She was really scared of the Chinese. She felt what the Putin government is doing with China is really bad. They're getting too close to China, that basically Russians should westernize and get closer to the EU and to the United States. And I kind of tried to dissuade her of this kind of yellow peril fear. And I said, if Russia is lucky, it can become the Canada of Eurasia. And it is, literally, it is becoming the Canada of Eurasia. I mean, it's starting to export huge amounts of oil, gas, and minerals to this huge country down below, China. Yes, India kind of owns the Indian Ocean, which, by the way, Indian foreign policy officials all say. We don't want anybody in the Indian Ocean, not the Americans, nobody, okay? But India is still quite weak. And you really have China that kind of dominates, just purely geographically, East Asia and Asia as a whole. It's really huge. And China has, as I mentioned, this kind of policy of maybe Canadianizing? Is that the right one? Canadianizing? Russia. You see all of these pipelines that are going into China. They actually are planning another pipeline here. This one is not being built. These have been built, actually. This one has been built. This is a pipeline through Burma, through Myanmar, that starts in Sittwe and can take basically oil from there right into what is southwestern China. And then Chinese ships don't have to go through the Straits of Malacca, which Chinese strategists see as a choke point that the US Navy could close off at any point. So it's basically, again, a form of independence from the US Navy. And there's plans, obviously, of having a pipeline here. And you see this little country here. It's not little, actually. It's quite important, is Iran. And at some point, the Chinese would love to actually just to avoid sea lanes, because then they can import oil directly from Iran without any, the United States cannot say anything. Let me go on here. I just, this is more for your information, put up a few newer ones just to show you that all of this actually has been built. This is the main Russian one out. So they built it all to Nakotka, so they can actually export oil and gas to Japan and South Korea as well. Main line goes into Daqing, which is a large Chinese oil producing region, but the oil is running out. You have this through Myanmar. We still have Burma here, but our government, very interestingly, about a year ago, what was it? About a year and 4 months ago, all of a sudden the State Department moved from Burma to Myanmar. Wasn't that nice? Calling people what they want to call themselves. And then you have this kind of Central Asian, and here I just put on, this is the internal Chinese pipeline map. So the Chinese are building massive amounts of pipelines also within their own country, especially from the west into the east. All the population is in the east, the resources are in the west, and further outside of China in Central Asia. So there's been huge amounts of building going on here. We end up with this issue. I put this in newly because of what was going on in Washington, D.C. For me, what Washington, D.C. has been doing is basically suicide. It's the only way. It's basically, you've become a great power so oblivious to the law of relative rise and decline that rather than waiting for your decline in a kind of gentlemanly manner, you take a gun and put it to your head and shoot yourself. Yeah. Really, that's what they've been doing. I mean, the Chinese have had problems. There's huge amounts of capital flows. There's always hard. Last year, China actually had capital outflows because people were scared that Chinese growth will subside. This year, they've had huge inflows, and a lot of it is hot money. It's complicated. A lot of it has to do also with trade and people speculating, but a lot of it is to take advantage of the yuan. And I can tell you, the yuan is one of the best investments you could ever have. I mean, look at this, this is deposits. I don't have the exchange rate. But the yuan is basically appreciated by 35%. And on a 1-year CD, you get a 3% return. So, I mean, if the Chinese would open up, you would have basically a mass of money flowing into China, unless there's a perception that there will be political or economic problems in China. And that's always a problem, because again, the system is not very transparent. But you can see basically this is the rise of deposits in Hong Kong of yuan. This is the offshore. This is the book by Barry Eichengreen, Exorbitant Privilege, where he kind of really lays out the history of the dollar. Basically, it's a very interesting history of the dollar in here. The dollar was totally unimportant internationally until 1913. And within several years became the international currency. Again, that tells us also to be careful. Things can go really fast if the other side mucks up. The British mucked up. What did they do in 1914? Fought a war, okay? So everybody went into the dollar. Somebody in the Financial Times had this beautiful comment to a piece that was saying the yuan will become a global reserve currency very soon. And I love the comment. Said, a currency where you need to carry around suitcases full of it to pay for anything like a house or a car will never become a global currency, because the biggest denomination of the yuan is actually 100 bill. But to be honest, they can change that snip the fingers. And then this is basically just the value of the dollar. Not that other currencies would have fared much better, but you can see from 1913, when the Federal Reserve was established, basically how it went down in its purchasing value. And this is kind of a long-term problem for all of us. Okay, last one. The environment, I will just leave you. This is a beautiful image from 2002. I felt I should go look for some newer ones, but you basically can see the muck that hangs over China, especially, I'm not going to take this out again. You'll all hear me. Down here in the south, you really see, this is a clear sky, but you really see the muck. Then here, these are clouds, but up here you really see the northern China plain muck, which is the worst. There was just a recent study done in China that said people who live north of the Huaihai River have 5.5 years less life expectancy than people who live south of it. Basically because the north, where Beijing is, and Tianjin is the most polluted. It's really deeply polluted. These are the newer ones. It certainly doesn't look any better. It's really kind of difficult to see. This is again the north. Here's the Yellow Sea. This is Beijing, roughly here. Here's Tianjin. So again, this is the Yangtze River here. This is the haze that hangs kind of over this north of the Huaihai River area. So basically, Shanghai is although not a very pleasant climate and with considerable air pollution, but Shanghai is really pleasant compared to somewhere like Beijing. A friend of mine, we knew somebody that moved to Beijing to start a business because lots of things are going on. And somebody in Hawaii said, "So why would you move to Beijing? Do you want to live 5 years less?" It's true. It's really quite bad. It's an interesting city, but the muck has become extremely, extremely bad. And the Chinese government now is really putting in resources to clean it up. But it's kind of like, you clean up one place and new pollution emerges in terms of cars and other things as you move along. And I will end here. Thank you. So if you have any questions, comments, anything, yes?
You mentioned oil production in the Middle East and how they're becoming the biggest importer of oil China is. And you said that they are interested in deposing dictators there. Does that mean that they're basically have completely given up on any concept of communism or spreading their ideology to other countries?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, this was Mao. Mao was quite intent on spreading communism to other countries and started guerrilla wars in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and obviously the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. I mean, the worst example. If we feel bad about supporting people like Saddam Hussein, whom we did, creating the Taliban single-handedly, what we did, and supporting people like what was the dictator in Nicaragua, or Pinochet in Chile, we can all kind of walk away that we never supported something like the Khmer Rouge, which was really just absolute Pol Pot's genocide regime is probably the worst that we ever seen. So, in terms of population, percentages. But now, as I mentioned before, the Chinese have become the quintessential pragmatists. What has changed is that they feel they've garnered enough international power to become a lot more assertive, especially in their region, and especially what concerns sea lanes. So that's really what the struggle about the Senkaku and the South China Sea is about. It's about the idea of Chinese greatness and sovereignty, which is very symbolically, we've owned this historically. Who cares about the historical record? They probably, you probably could argue. I mean, you see how big China is and how important they were 200 years ago. Yes, probably we could say they kind of owned it. Yeah. So, but there was no international law. There was no, UN Convention of the Seas. They're very interested in those areas because of resources. Both of them should have oil and gas. And they're very interested in them strategically because that's where a lot of their trade flows through. And you have to see it just like any other capitalist developer. Any other country that has developed rapidly a form of capitalism has become dependent on imports of resources. And as a result, began building a navy. And as a result, began basically enforcing its ideas of what the right rules and norms are globally at some point, if they ever became that big. And one of the more unfortunate examples, but also kind of classical ones, is Japan. As Japan became more industrialized and was totally dependent on foreign resources, they rapidly began building a navy. And in 1904, it was the first non-Western power that defeated a Western power, which is actually, I think, can almost take as kind of a historical watershed. They fought the Russians. So hopefully we don't see that kind of a pattern obtained with China, but undoubtedly their foreign policy has become more assertive in their region. But once you go to the Middle East, they are the absolute pragmatists. So the new crown prince of Saudi Arabia, when he came into power, he first visited China. Saudi Arabia is the biggest oil supplier to China now. So they just you can't get around the Saudis. We had a question there from the gentleman, Michael? No.
Well, one word that I haven't heard is fascism. And I think an interesting take, ideologically, on what is unfolding before our eyes is not just the rise of big multinational corporations like Monsanto and others, but state-supported corporations, or whether they're private or public corporations, creating a pragmatic fascism. That's an interesting thought to me. And the ramifications to me are not just political, but the environmental impact. I'd like you to comment not just on air pollution, but on how such consumption of energy, as the Chinese are engaging, creating an energy gap with the United States, is this going to utterly destroy or alter our environment and climate change? On the broadest scale, I'm concerned about 5 years less life expectancy in northern China. But I see the Chinese behavior and the United States, in a sense, trying to compete with that behavior, and India later competing even more with the same consumer of energy behavior, destroying the planet. Do you see the planet?
I'll first, step by step, fascism. I have myself used this somewhat, never in writing, but just in talks like this with respect to China. Because you have certain elements of, and fascism here is not National Socialism, okay? I mean, we're talking about fascism like Mussolini. The Italians invented fascism. Okay, so you can imagine it's not such a serious affair. Italians always, it's always, yeah, I mean, the Italians never, gassed Jews. It was Hitler who told them to do so. I mean, they weren't really that interested. They didn't treat the Roma and the Gypsies very well, but they don't do so now as well. It's a difficult word to use because of all the connotations it brings with it. See, I already have to start to explain it here, and I can go on with the definition. But I'd rather use the term I use the term refurbished state capitalism because it's a new form of state capitalism. State capitalism existed under Stalinism, the really state socialist system, and under fascism. Now, Hitler actually started to really gobble up all the private companies towards the late 1930s. So there you actually see, fascism and National Socialism going into the direction of much closer to what Stalin already was doing then. And private enterprise wasn't that welcome. Again, the Italians never went that far. And it is a new trend, this trend of state capitalism. But what I need to emphasize is that these Chinese state-owned conglomerates are, in a sense, different animals because they have quite a lot of autonomy from the party state. Yes, the top people are party cadres, they're under the nomenclatura system, meaning that they should be subservient to the party. But the recent corruption scandal we've been having, which involves one of the biggest state-owned oil companies, CNPC, is all about basically CNPC being this autonomous fiefdom that does whatever it pleases and pushes the government around, rather than the other way. So it's a more complicated system, I would argue, than kind of, because we've used the term fascism, you label it and you give people a certain impression. It's more complicated, it's more capitalist, actually, than, but you could easily argue that.
Marx considered the final stage of capitalism to be fascism.
Yeah, Lenin, imperialism, etc. But I actually think that there's enough liberal inclinations in China that, and because of where we are, we have basically American hegemony for over 50 years, and especially since 1980, very strong neoliberal slant. That is actually really influencing what the Chinese are doing. That's why they're building up the Shanghai Free Trade Zone now, which should basically open itself up to foreign capital in really a Hong Kong way. And don't forget Hong Kong. Hong Kong has been very influential for Chinese vision of economic reform, much more so than we think. And Hong Kong is really this quintessentially neoliberal place. Although I always laugh if the Heritage Foundation says, oh, it's economic freedom #1. Yeah, but you've got universal health care and 40% of the people in social housing and the best public transport in the world. Okay. So, and Singapore as well. 85% of people in Singapore in public housing, okay. These freedom indexes have their own problem. But so I think it's more complex. That's what I argue in some of my writings as well, that this refurbished form of state capitalism is really quite a potent new force because it really incorporates quite a few neoliberal principles. Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan are doing wonderful business in China and advising these companies and bringing them up to speed.
Well, is it a force then for global ecological disaster?
The second one, unfortunately, I have to just agree with you. I mean, at the University of Hawaii, we have a team of geographers who recently just published, I think it was either in Nature or Science, one of the two top journals. And what they did is basically take all climate models, I think 20-something, and put them together into a meta-model, supermodel. And they took a very, very simple yardstick. And that is, when will the lowest highs be higher than the highest highs now? You understand what I'm saying? So let's say today, October 21st, the highest highs on average in Portland, Oregon is probably going to be 80 degrees, I suspect, just out of the top of my head. Okay, I lived up in Seattle. It's colder than here. Some people feel the weather's better here, but I really don't know. And it is. I mean, look at this. Wow. Yeah. We should be even. Thankfully, you've got a nice view. And so if it's 80 degrees, that would mean that the coldest day on October 21st has a high that is higher than 80. That means your average would be, 80 something. I mean, that's much, much higher. Turns out the place that will reach it the fastest is going to be the tropics. Not because you have so much higher, amplifications here. And basically for Honolulu, it's going to be 2043. For Kingston, Jamaica, it's going to be 2023. And the model takes into account that we keep on spewing out CO2 at the same levels that we're now, which I think is conservative. Because China, and you're absolutely correct, the next big one is India. And some people in Europe I've talked to actually are more hopeful about China because they feel that China, yes, will muck up the environment, will pollute, but then they have a strong central state that really can implement reforms to drive the economy more rapidly towards alternative energy and low energy consumption. But India would be much more difficult. The Middle East is spewing out stuff as well. Don't forget about other areas, And we in the United States just have been lucky because we found all the gas. And so that's brought our energy down. We have more efficient cars, all your Prius drivers. And we have, somebody's laughing, somebody has a Prius. And basically natural gas, which replaces coal. But honestly, I'm not very optimistic. That's all I can say. It's because I know the history of capitalism writ large. It's not just China. It's capitalism. That's the problem. And we need to retool capitalism to an extent that, it's very difficult to fathom. We basically would have to stop income taxes. Oh, wow, I'm sounding like a Republican. And only have consumption taxes. Yes, we should. Why do we tax what is good, income, and not tax what is bad, consumption? But imagine our system moving from a consumption-based to a production-based system. And we would have to do a whole lot of other things as well and redesign our cities. They're ridiculous the way we design our cities, including Portland. I know you really tried, but it's still ridiculous. The Chinese are doing a better job there, much better. Chinese cities are much more energy efficient than American cities, but still got 1.3 billion people. And it's a scary thought. So hopefully, you'll get palm trees here and that make you happy.
Is there any talk, to what extent would you say that the Chinese government or the Chinese people are already aware of environmental issues that they face?
Oh, very much so, very much so. And there's considerable pressure on the government to clean up the environment. Indeed, it's perhaps besides income inequalities and the corruption in the communist system that goes along with this, I would say it's clearly perhaps now becoming the second most important issues. For that would be middle class urban. But you don't forget, you still have about 500, 600 million people that are quite closely tied to the land. I'm saying that because if you go to Chinese villages, there's a saying now, you'll only find old people and children. Everybody in the middle has left already. But people are still quite tied to the land because of the residency system. And a lot of those people are, for them it's still very modern. China's a very modern society. It comes back to what Michael was saying. And it's a very modern society. It's not very postmodern yet, in the sense that everybody still really kind of thinks we want to get wealthy. And the newest fad in China is what? Sending your children to the United States. So they're bringing their pollution here in a kind of roundabout way. That everybody is. I mean, that's what immigration does. So I would argue that environment is very top of the scale. Just to basically tell you what Beijing is trying to do, they're again clamping down on car ownership. They're trying to redo the coal-powered power plants, making them cleaner. But clean coal is extremely expensive and technologically not very mature. They'd love to go into natural gas if they could, but for that they have to frack, and to frack they need a lot of water, and they don't have that. Unfortunately, the Chinese have come up with even a slightly ridiculous proposal, which is basically coal to gas. They're trying to build huge plants to make that, but that's going to, again, spew huge amounts of CO2. Longer term, it's actually bad for global warming. It's good for the people who die earlier in northern China. But it's bad for the globe. So you enter with all these kinds of trade-offs and things. But again, in partial praise of the Chinese, I don't want to hold them up as a goal, but at least they're investing like mad in public transportation. I mean, there's nowhere in the world where public transportation is built to the same extent it is in China. From subway systems to high-speed rail systems. And again, high-speed rail is one of the most energy-efficient ways of transporting people in the world, so that we have so far. Yeah, it's probably going to take quite some time. And, maybe unfortunately, the Chinese are very stoic people. Ren, a knife and a heart. That character is everywhere in China. And so I'm astonished how people can stand Beijing. I mean, I can do it for a few days. It's almost interesting, seeing how your lungs get clogged up and you take out your thing and all of a sudden it's black. Yeah, no, it is. It's black. It's black. But I couldn't stand living there, especially in the winter. We have one more question there.
So in your future map of the top 5 economies, it was China, US, Japan, India, and Brazil. And that seems like that we've never had. It's a new dynamic where the Western powers have slowly sunk on the chart, and you'll have only one Western power in the top 5, which means that the relationships of tradition and history and aesthetics, everything will be different. And I wonder if that will change anything.
The problem is, this is a very, very good question, by the way, which I could go on for a long time because it also comes into a lot of the humanities side. And I think aesthetics already are changing, by the way. I mean, just look at, fashion and things like that. So there's going to be really, especially China as a huge consumer market, is really going to change, certain aesthetical principles. So, what is the Pamela Andersons will probably be less kind of, just to give you a very kind of lurid example. But to come back to kind of more seriousness, the problem with most of these countries, and including India as well, and Brazil is somewhat different because Brazil has had a kind of slower trajectory of development. And we can argue whether Brazil and India will make it, by the way. So there is, if you look at what's happening in India now, there might be arguments. Many Chinese I know argue that India will never make it. It'll die in a sea of people. It'll be swamped with people and just sink, in a sense. So that's a very Chinese perspective of the world because the Chinese are very scared of too many people. That's the thing you hear in China all the time. 人太多, 人太多. Too many people, too many people, too many people. So, but the Chinese in particular, which I think is really the guerrilla talking about this. They're still very much infatuated by the Western model. I mean, for them, I just read an article coming over here, is basically that modernization is still defined as following the Western road of capitalist development, with its variations upon Japan and Germany, especially Japan and Germany, much more so than the US and England, but nonetheless, still a very Western model of full-out modernization, industrialization, urbanization, the building of a middle class, technological sophistication. All of that is deeply, deeply ingrained in the Chinese mind. That is good, and that's the way we're going. So I don't see China developing at this point or in the next decade a novel way of ordering the world. Now, once China becomes really powerful, they might actually take more international responsibility than the United States. So that I can believe, because honestly, the bar hasn't been set very high. So, yeah, no, the United States is a beautiful superpower because we basically say we're exceptional. So we don't have to follow any rules, but you all follow my rules. And we've done so. Consistently. You look at the law of the seas. We tell everybody, you follow the law of the seas, but oh, sorry, the Senate has never signed it. So if something comes up and our military does something, no, we're not a signatory, sorry. So there's a real schizophrenia. If China follows this, which I wouldn't be too astonished about as well, I mean, I don't think there's anything culturally or historically that will predispose China to be much more benevolent. And by the way, the United States is already much better than the Brits and much better than the Spaniards before. So. Yeah, we're better. No, we're better. The Brits were really, I mean, anyway. We want to go into that history. We haven't colonized people, okay? We haven't really raped people to the same extent. Semi-colonized, but we can go on. It's a matter of degree. So, and will the Chinese be much better? I don't know. But again, coming from a slightly European slant, their belief in powerful, centralized state power, and state influence, might actually bring a positive cultural change to international governance, which would mean we really want to build international institutions that have real teeth, real power, and can really change human behavior in terms of things like the environment. So a global CO tax. Because you cannot have a carbon tax in one country. Look what happened with Australia. Australia very boldly moved forward. We're going to implement a carbon tax. And then they found out, but nobody else is doing it. So we're just going to basically be the suckers. Yeah, it's really true. So those things I have hope that the Chinese might be slightly wiser. But I grew up in Switzerland, small power, very clever, very nimble power, but small. And I can tell you, all big powers are ugly. None of them. You're a big power, ugliness emerges. It's like if you're a bully in the schoolyard, your ugly sides will become known. So last question from the gentleman here.
I have a question about educational trends and whether or not the Chinese government will get to a point of mass exportation of university students to places like the United States.
We're already there. I'm just giving you an example. This is very personal. This is my nephew. He's in Chengdu, so this is not the coast. This is inland, far inland. And, but he's in one of the best high schools there, so number 7. It's nice how these Chinese high schools still have numbers. I kind of find it very quaint now. I think actually we should build up a fashion brand with all this communist logo and stuff. Communism is cute, kind of. It's just if you're in marketing or so. To come back to your question, and his school basically, he's now going to graduate next year. But 2 years ago, the school basically went to the parents and said, you've got 2 options. Option number 1 is you're going to go do the Gaokao, which is the university entrance examination. Option number 2, you're going to do the TOEFL and the SAT. And that decides your future. Because if you're not doing Gaokao, you will not get into a university in China. Okay? And if you do TOEFL and SAT, you will have to go to the United States. So, and again, this is in the West. It's a provincial capital. It's quite rich. But it's not Shanghai or Guangzhou or Shenzhen or Beijing or Tianjin. And half of the students are in the American track. Half. The SAT is not administered in China. So everybody has to fly to Hong Kong to do it. The day the SAT is held, And by the way, in Hong Kong, they are now holding it in huge rooms. They have 1,000, 2,000 students doing it in one location. They have about 20, 30 locations throughout Hong Kong where they're doing it. All the hotels are booked. All the flights are booked. It's become huge business for Hong Kong, basically, for the whole economy. You know? And so you have basically, this is a trend where Chinese students were coming to the United States for graduate studies in big numbers already over the past decade. Now it has come as undergraduates, and increasingly, as it happened with Hong Kong, we had, by the way, the very same pattern, but Hong Kong's small, never really kind of, you know, emerged like that and wasn't that influential. Now they're moving down to high school, because then they also can get a green card, and it's much easier. The Chinese already know it's much easier to get into a good university if you've done 2-3 years of senior high in the United States. So you're getting a trend of students getting younger and younger, of preparing earlier and earlier. They're making the decision basically, we're not going to go to China, forget about it. You know, this is a black and white decision. And we're more. So this kind of flooding, basically, this mass exportation, which by the way is not driven by the government, this is driven by the people themselves. They don't trust the Chinese education system. They think the universities all are rotten. It's all about corruption. You pay somebody to do your essays. You don't do the work yourself. There's huge amounts of plagiarism and other types of problems. Not that China's immune. We've had huge problems in Germany with that. 3 ministers got canned because they have plagiarized PhDs. So it happens in other places too. But it's a real problem. And they just believe that American education is by far superior. And so you get schools from Cornell all the way to, you know, University of Delaware, probably right. Community college is not on a radar screen, but stuff like Portland State and Portland University, and then some of the private universities, Willamette, et cetera, University of Oregon down in Eugene, you're seeing it, you must be seeing this already happening now. And you know, my nephew has done very well on his SATs. I think the first one he got 1970 or something, and he wants to get more. So he just did it again in October. He has, well, I don't know what is it, 97 it was on the TOEFL, which I think is quite good. They changed it. He wants to get above 100. But this is broad. I mean, this is really and as China gets richer, this is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So each year you probably could see a doubling of the numbers easily in the next, you know, 5, 6, 7 years. So this mass exploitation, it's happening. It's happening already. What it means for China, what it means for the US, it's going to be very interesting. I'm actually very pro that, because Chinese that come to the United States will understand the US a lot better. They will be able to introduce China also to their classmates. It'll bring our countries together in a way that other policies can't. And it's basically happening because the Chinese are as Confucian as anybody comes. And the best education in the world is the United States. So that's it. And Australia now is very expensive. It basically got priced out of the market because of the very high Aussie dollar. The UK is coming. And Europe. Europe has huge amounts of Chinese students because they found out that if they learn German, poor Chinese, they get free tuition. Lucky Chinese. So yeah, Germany still has basically free tuition. It's about €1,000 a year. So it's really insignificant. I know somebody who went to Finland to study for his master. Yeah, also from Chengdu. So you see Chinese everywhere now. But it's this mass exportation, and it's nicely the way you put it. It's going on. It's right now that we are seeing this happening. So you need to position yourselves to take advantage one way or another. Oh. Okay, very last question, since you're all the way in the back. I can't resist.
Yeah, you mentioned about the house bubble. So what do you think about the house bubble in Beijing, especially in Beijing or Shanghai, big cities?
Yeah, you probably own property there, so you're interested, or you want to buy something.
No, I think it's like kind of like people who don't own a house are waiting for the house bubble. But people own the house, they are so happy because the price is kind of ridiculously increasing.
You're in a kind of similar situation that we had in the United States, you know, where we basically had housing prices decline, and that is, China is in that sense very similar to the United States. In many ways, actually, you almost have to be American to understand China, because because big countries are different. They click differently, you know. Big countries take their national flag and make it, in 20 yards, 15 yards down and hang it like this, We wouldn't do that in Switzerland, We have a nice little flag that's there. It don't have to be that big. Mexico does it, but that's because it's close to the US. They learned it from us. This is something new in China. I never saw such big. Now all of a sudden in Guangzhou airport, huge Chinese, Wuxingqi, the 5-star up there. But to come back to that, the Chinese, like Americans, are obsessed with property ownership. It is the means to riches. It is also the means of asset accumulation, of your wealth. And in a sense, China has been historically so. The gentry has always invested in land, and now the Chinese people are doing the same thing. So I personally believe that as in the United States, when our housing prices came down, the Federal Reserve did everything it could to prop up the market. It's been printing money with no ending. It's money printing ad infinity. The Germans go like this, because they think about the Weimar Republic. But so far we've been okay. And housing prices have recovered quite nicely. I think in Portland as well. Seattle, Portland have been doing quite well. In Hawaii, they're back where they were in 2007. California, they're getting quite close. Depends on where you are again. So in China, I think we are facing a similar situation. Tell your friends that if they want to buy, they probably will have to buy now. Because prices have softened a tiny little bit, but I don't think that the communist government will ever let them drop more than 20%. They'll put in, and they have the means to do that. Because right now, very unlike the United States, and again, a short word of praise for the Chinese distrust of markets, they have treated real estate with lots of distrust. So as real estate prices have gone up, it was not like Alan Greenspan saying, let the prices go up and let it happen. Irrational exuberance, fine, but he didn't do anything. The Chinese have been really doing things like upping down payments, making it tough to get loans, not allowing people to buy second homes, and so on. So right now, you actually have a market that has been quite constrained for the last two years, roughly. And yet has been actually going up and then steadying and then going up and steadying. It's not going up that much, but it's ridiculously high in places like Beijing and Shanghai. But I don't think that prices are going to drop a lot there. Really not. Because you have a new middle class, and what they own is their property. Some of you probably know musicians, and in the United States, musicians are perennially poor. It's really a very poor profession unless you're Yo-Yo Ma or, Miley Cyrus, Katy Perry or so. But these are classical musicians. They teach at the conservatory in Shanghai, and they each bought 2 flats in 1999. Now they're multimillionaires. Each of the flats is worth $2.5 million US. So they each have like 5 million just laying there. It's not the place they live in. And it's created immense wealth, immense middle class assets. And if you start to tinker with that, it's easy to get a revolution. So I just think the way, governments always can print money. They always can inflate themselves out. Again, in praise of what they've been doing so far, is they try to keep prices from totally getting out of whack. But yet in those cities, they're clearly overpriced. But again, it's like in all others. It's like Tokyo, it's like New York. Who of you could afford a place in Manhattan? Forget it. It's impossible. Shanghai's the same thing. In the inner city or in Beijing, within the third ring road, forget it. Once you go further out, 5th, 6th ring road, then you can actually afford it. But then, Shidong is laughing. You got a dreadful commute then, You live in New Jersey, okay, in Newark, even further out. So, so I don't think they're going to drop too much. And for the people who own flats, it's been a really good ride. It's been really incredible. Most of you don't know this, but China has overnight created this property-owning, wealthy middle class. People who have real money. Thanks.